Hello, this is Max. An unknown person, using manipulation and lies, commands others to fulfill demands over the phone. The film is based on real events. Don't forget to subscribe. On a busy day at a local Chickwich franchise, Sandra, the manager, begins her day by receiving a bacon supply delivery. She then assembles the restaurant staff for a meeting to address an issue with the freezer that caused bacon to spoil overnight. Despite the staff's lack of enthusiasm, Sandra emphasizes the importance of doing their jobs correctly due to an impending secret shopper quality control audit. She stresses the need to serve the right portions, maintain cleanliness, and stay organized.
Let's get to work.
During a brief moment, Sandra shares her excitement about her boyfriend's plans to propose, and two of her employees congratulate her. Amidst a busy shift, Sandra takes a break to answer a call from her boyfriend, Van, who requests permission to visit and have a beer with friends. Sandra agrees but warns him not to get too drunk. Meanwhile, some employees, including Connie, Becky, and Kevin, vent their frustrations about their shifts. Sandra overhears Connie complaining and assigns her to the condiment bar. Becky and Kevin exchange knowing looks, sensing Sandra's irritability. Just then, Sandra receives a call from Officer Daniels, introduced as someone who has spoken to their regional manager, Robert Chilmore, about an employee allegedly stealing money from a customer. Officer Daniels describes the suspect, matching Becky's description, and claims they have a witness. He requests Sandra's cooperation in handling Becky.
I have to bring her in back for some questions.
Sandra summons Becky to the office, confronts her about the theft, and reports it to the officer. Daniels interrogates Becky, who maintains her innocence. Daniels instructs Sandra to search Becky's pockets and confiscate her phone, but no stolen money is found. He then orders a search of Becky's purse. Despite Becky's objections, Sandra proceeds with the search. After finding nothing incriminating, Daniels insists on further investigation, asking Sandra to keep Becky in the office while waiting for his marked units. Sandra agrees but expresses doubts about Becky's involvement, noting that they hadn't had trouble with her before. The caller suggests that if Becky were guilty, she might have hidden evidence, prompting Sandra to consider this possibility. When Daniels requests to speak with Becky again, she attempts to plead her case and answer his questions honestly. However, the officer's intimidation leaves Becky following his orders silently. Despite her insistence that she doesn't have the stolen money, Daniels asks to speak with Sandra once more. He presents two options for dealing with Becky. The first involves taking her to jail with a lengthy investigation process, while the other option is for Sandra to personally search her. Both women are reluctant, but the caller suggests that the investigation might result in a 90% chance of conviction, making the search a potential lifesaver for Becky. Ultimately, they agree, with the condition that Marty conducts the search.
She say yes?
Yeah, can you just bring Marty in here?
Yeah.
While Sandra goes to find Marty, Becky is left alone to converse with Daniels, who advises her to act as though the investigation process doesn't bother her to make things easier for her colleagues. Out of the blue, the officer also inquires about Becky's brother, who appears to have ongoing legal troubles. When Sandra briefs Marty about the need to search Becky, Marty protests, believing that Becky would never steal from someone. However, Sandra is committed to following the officer's instructions, and the search begins. Sandra reports finding nothing after examining Becky's discarded clothes. Still unconvinced, Daniels instructs Sandra to check Becky's undergarments. Both women apologize to Becky, who embarrassingly covers herself with an apron provided by Marty. Despite failing to find the stolen money, Daniels persists. This time, he instructs Sandra to take Becky's clothes to her car to prevent her from retrieving the money when they aren't looking, citing it as standard protocol not to return the clothes to the perpetrator until the police have searched them, as alterations could be made to hide evidence. Sandra becomes suspicious of the increasingly unusual orders and the absence of any arriving officers. The caller explains that they can't come immediately because they are currently investigating Becky's brother's involvement in illegal substances at her house. When Sandra attempts to share this information with her employees, the officer insists it's confidential and claims that Becky's clothes may contain traces of the substances, potentially aiding in their case. Sandra complies, taking Becky's clothing and placing them in her car while leaving the passenger door unlocked, as per Daniel's instruction. However, as the restaurant becomes busier, Sandra tells the officer she needs to return to managing the store. Daniels agrees, but only if a trusted male employee can watch over Becky for security reasons. Sandra enlists Kevin for the task. When Sandra briefs Kevin about the situation, he finds it hard to believe as he personally knows Becky and her brother. He's even more surprised to see his friend with only an apron on. Kevin then engages in conversation with Daniels, inquiring about the alleged crime while attempting to defend Becky. Unbeknownst to them, the mysterious Officer Daniels is actually a prank caller, comfortably sitting in his own home and enjoying a drink. As their conversation continues, the caller starts to provoke Kevin by ordering him to inspect Becky's body. Kevin finds the caller's absurdity amusing and refuses to take the instructions seriously. The prank caller asserts his authority, demanding Kevin to address him as sir and insisting that Kevin remove Becky's apron to inspect her body.
Let me ask you one more thing. Were you two ever an item?
Despite threats from the caller about disobeying an officer, Kevin steps out and informs Sandra that he refuses to get involved because Becky is his friend. In response, Sandra talks to the caller again to apologize for what happened. The caller insists that someone must watch over Becky and asks if Sandra is married. Sandra, hesitatingly, mentions that she's about to be married, so the caller suggests that her fiancé, Van, come to the restaurant. Van arrives at the restaurant, slightly drunk, and Sandra takes him to the office where Becky is being held. She explains his task to him, but he questions the need to follow Daniel's orders, without specifying what those orders entail. Sandra, who seems to enjoy her involvement in the case, becomes an easy pawn to manipulate Van into complying with the caller's ludicrous demands. When Sandra leaves the room and may not return for a while, the prank caller starts giving obscene orders, insisting that Becky remove the apron. As Becky refuses, the caller requests to speak to her directly.
Look around at where you are.
While speaking to Becky, he threatens to lock her up in jail, mentioning her potential involvement in her brother's case. He assures Becky that her cooperation could lead to a reduced sentence and possibly help her avoid legal trouble. Feeling helpless, Becky agrees to take off her apron in front of Van. When the phone is handed back to Van, the caller starts asking him explicit and invasive questions about Becky's private parts. He even instructs Van to conduct a cavity search on Becky, which she reluctantly obeys. Van then asks if he can give the apron back to Becky, but the caller stops him and orders Becky to perform jumping jacks to shake out any money she might be hiding. While all this unfolds in the back room, the other employees remain oblivious to what's happening. Kevin becomes worried and tries to inquire about Becky's brother's whereabouts by texting his friends. Connie advises him not to interfere with the police officers, so Kevin decides to focus on his work. After some time, Sandra briefly visits the room, and Van hastily makes Becky wear the apron again. Sandra learns that there has been no progress in the investigation and decides to talk to the caller, who reassures her that everything is under control. Despite Becky's pleas to stop the investigation, Sandra dismisses her concerns. As Van and the caller continue their conversation, the caller becomes concerned about running out of phone minutes and rushes to top up his phone. He uses the excuse that he's facing issues with the investigation at Becky's house. Meanwhile, Kevin expresses his discomfort to Marty about leaving Van alone with Becky. However, both of them lack the ability to challenge Sandra's decisions. On one hand, the caller regains his composure and proceeds to instruct Van to discipline Becky as a consequence for her disobedience towards Sandra's orders. Helpless and exhausted, Becky ceases her protests and submits, leaning over Van's lap. The man wastes no time and fulfills the directive, seemingly deriving enjoyment from the situation. When Marty eventually manages to speak with Sandra, she inquires about Van and Becky's predicament. Sandra maintains her unwavering belief that nothing will go wrong, emphasizing that her boyfriend is watching over Becky while they await the arrival of the police. Marty offers to take over guarding Becky if the restaurant becomes less busy, and the manager agrees to monitor the situation. Despite Sandra's denial and unwavering confidence that nothing could go awry, Becky is compelled to comply with Van, who blindly follows the indecent commands. As the manager later brings them food, she is met with silence and wonders why Van isn't answering the phone. Consumed by guilt, Van mumbles a brief farewell before leaving, and Sandra, who is always gullible, questions why her lover departed without kissing her. Meanwhile, the dissatisfied caller once again instructs Sandra to find another male replacement to watch over Becky. When Harold takes over, the caller subjects him to similar questions and orders, just as he did with Kevin and Van. However, unlike Van, Harold immediately objects and reports the caller's requests to Sandra. Sandra finally becomes alert and contacts the regional manager to inquire about the situation at the store. To her astonishment, she learns that Robert is unaware of the theft due to illness. Upon hearing this, Sandra speaks to the caller again, demanding to know his identity. After making light of ordering some food, he abruptly hangs up. Finally comprehending that she has been deceived, Sandra falls silent and feels ashamed. Kevin quickly takes the phone and attempts to call the number, but to no avail. After some time, the actual police arrive at the restaurant to investigate the crime. They confiscate the surveillance video's hard drive and question the employees. When asked why she complied with the caller's requests, Becky resignedly explains that she knew it would happen regardless. On the other hand, the mysterious man retains the items he used in his prank call before greeting his young daughter. The detective assigned to the case continues the search for the perpetrator and eventually discovers that the scheme took place at a fast food restaurant in another state. By tracing the stores where he purchased the prepaid cell phones used in the calls, authorities eventually locate the man, who turns out to be a telemarketer. The police apprehend him at his workplace. On the flip side, Becky meets with a lawyer to initiate a civil suit against Sandra. Her lawyer suggests suing the Chickwich National Corporation instead, to hold them accountable for the various crimes that occurred across different branches and for failing to implement policies and warnings against this type of hoax. Sandra, now unemployed, has also severed her ties with Van. Feeling responsible for what transpired, she agrees to an interview with a journalist who questions her about the incident. She attempts to explain that her respect for bureaucratic authority led her to comply with the prank caller's instructions. She admits her foolishness but also believes she was a victim of the malicious prank call. As the questioning continues, Sandra's recollection of the events becomes foggy. However, with the surveillance footage as evidence, her lawyer advises her to avoid questions that could further incriminate her. As Sandra watches the footage of the incident, tears well up in her eyes. To conceal her guilt, she resorts to making small talk with the journalist and forces a fake smile. Unfortunately, over 70 real incidents similar to Becky's have occurred in 30 US states. If you are interested in such films, please proceed to the next video on the screen and also share your thoughts about this film in the comments. Give us a like and subscribe. Goodbye.